Hi, folks. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome back, or welcome to those of you tuning in to this year's 2021 virtual Rower and Jerome pilgrimage. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am so delighted to introduce our presenter for today's final live session, Sherry Tamashiro. Sherry is a 3.5 generation Okinawan Japanese American. She works as a librarian at Kapiolani Community College and curated the Looking Like the Enemy exhibit at Pearl Harbor. Sherry has a passion for preservation, storytelling, and history. She created the Hawaii Nisei Stories website and served as president of the board of trustees of the Hawaiian Historical Society. Sherry is also the first foreign and first female World ASA ambassador appointed by the government of Okinawa. I will also say that if you're with Sherry, you are guaranteed to eat well. So just a wonderful historian, storyteller, and person. Sherry, thank you so much for being here. I'm so looking forward to hearing your presentation and asking you some questions afterwards.
Aloha, and it's so lovely to see you virtually. So, my name is Sherry Tamashiro. I'm a librarian at Kapiolani Community College. Today, I want to tell you about a little known story involving Japanese American soldiers from Hawaii. It's a story that I first heard from Rei Nosaka of the 100th Infantry Battalion. It's about a secret dog training that used Rei and his fellow Nisei soldiers as dog bait. There's not a lot of information on this topic except for Rei Nosaka and Yasuo Takata's unpublished manuscript. Rei did a number of interviews on the topic, and the story has been featured on the University of Hawaii's Hawaii Nisei Story website. There's a young adult book called Eyes of the Emperor by, I think, Graham Salisbury that covers the topic. And fairly recently, PBS's History Detectives covered the topic as well. This story concerns the 100th Infantry Battalion Separate. It was made up of Japanese Americans who were drafted before the attack on Pearl Harbor and were already in uniform. About 1,400 of these Nisei, second generation Japanese American soldiers, were sent to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin in June of 1942. I want to explain this because it's important. The military didn't know what to do with this segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers from Hawaii because nobody really wanted them at that time. So they weren't attached to any regiment. So their name was 100th Infantry Battalion, parentheses, separate. That means they were not attached to any regiment. And, these guys had already been drafted, so they went through their basic training. They were already serving actively in the military. But because they didn't know what to do with them, they were sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin for another round of training, even though they already had it. So what happens in November of 1942 at Camp McCoy is that 24 members of the 3rd Platoon Baker Company are selected for this secret mission. And, Ray said about 70 guys, so all the guys from Baker Company were pulled into a room and were told to answer all these questions from a questionnaire. Questions like, are you married? Are you divorced? Are your parents still alive? Do you really want to be an American citizen? So there was 20 pages of these kinds of questions that Ray thought were kind of silly, but they answered it anyways. From that group, 24 from Baker Company and 1 from headquarters were selected. Ray doesn't know what answers he gave that made him be selected. And, beyond the few that he told me about, we really don't know what the questions were. 20 pages of questions, right? So, destination unknown, these men were loaded onto a transport plane heading south following the Mississippi River. So, the officers of the company were Major James Lovell, Lieutenant Rocco Marzano, and Lieutenant Ernest Tanaka. So there are 24 men in Baker Company and 1 man from headquarters. So when they landed, no one was let out of the plane. They had these big army trucks that were completely covered up, that backed right up to the door of the plane. and the men jumped off the plane into the trucks with their bags. They didn't see anyone, and no one saw them. They were driven to a pier where a boat was waiting for them. Total secrecy. No one would tell them what they were doing, why they were there. So their destination was Ship Island, 20 miles off of Gulfport, Mississippi. And it's a small, flat island, about 2 miles wide and 10 miles long, with sandy beaches and tons of fish. The men had to clean out a barracks type building next to an abandoned fort, and this would be their home for the next 4 months. So, coming into the picture at this point is a Swiss refugee. His name was William Prester. And this guy convinced the US military that he could train dogs to scent and attack people with Japanese blood. He wanted to win the war by training a canine attack force of 20 to 30,000 dogs that he said could be trained to sniff out Japanese soldiers and hunt them down like in a first wave of island invasions. As absurd as this proposal sounded, the Army gave Prester 3 months to test the theory out. To test the theory out, they took American soldiers of Japanese descent, namely Ray and the other Nisei of the 100th, to be dog bait. So, the first days that they were spent exploring Ship Island, and actually, Erin, could you call up a map of it so people can see where it's located? So pretty remote island. The first days they actually had a lot of free time. They spent it exploring, fishing, boating, swimming. And the guys actually loved it because it felt like they were home. But eventually, they had to take a boat ride from Ship Island to Cat Island for the dog training. And it is kind of crazy that the dog training happened on Cat Island. But Cat Island is where the dogs were being quartered. So Cat Island had dense foliage. It had a jungle-like atmosphere with palmettos. It had swamps infested with mosquitoes and alligators. So it was about a half an hour boat trip from Ship Island to Cat Island. There was no dock to land on. It was really remote. The full name of that island was Cat Island War Dog Reception and Training Center. So they started off doing scout dog training. And, most started out by training scout dogs. So 5 of them went to the mainland to train sentry type attack dogs. So according to Ray, in the beginning, training these scout dogs was fun. So all they had to do was hide themselves in the jungle with horse meat. And, when they hid themselves, a lot of times they would climb a tree to hide. And each dog trainer would send their dog out to find their assigned soldier. So when the dogs did spot Ray, for example, the trainer would then fire a shot, and Ray was ordered to drop to the ground and hold the piece of meat up to his neck because they're teaching the dogs to go for the jugular. So, what ended up happening is that the dogs became really friendly with Ray guys. And when that happened, the trainers ordered Ray to make the dogs hate him using whips, slingshots, and rocks to hit the dog until they bled sometimes, because the goal was to make them hate the soldiers, the Nisei. And Ray talked about how difficult this was to do, but orders were orders. And, he mentioned getting scolded by the trainers and ordered to hit harder and harder. And, according to Ray's daughter, Anne, even decades later, and even up to when he was in his 80s, Ray would break down in tears whenever he remembered what he was ordered to do during this training. So after the scout dog training, they then had to do attack dog training and bloodhounds. So this is the point where they became dog bait. And they were actually farmed out in different groups according to the different types of dogs. So they were testing to see if different breeds of dogs would be more effective in certain circumstances. So, the group working with German Shepherds were Komatsu and Tanaka. Labradors and Chesapeake Bay Retrievers were assigned to Hirasuna and Kihara. Russian Wolfhounds were assigned to Mizusawa and Goshima. The Bouviers were Tanigawa and Takata. Airedales were Kanimura and Okuma. There was one guy assigned to patch up the the suits that they wore to protect. And Maeda and Rei Nosaka were actually working as to train the bloodhounds. So 3 people were left on Ship Island as caretakers. So Lieutenant Tanaka was the chief letter censor. Herbert Ishii was the chief cook. And so Herbert was the guy from headquarters. So I guess it makes sense. And then Yazawa was assistant cook. So any communication that did come out of the island was heavily censored because there could be no mention of dogs, island, or anything that they're doing, which included like fishing or whatever. So the German Shepherds, Labradors, and Chesapeake Bay Retrievers had the Nisei as live targets. But because of the ferocity of the Russian wolfhounds, dummies dressed in Japanese uniforms were used instead of live bait because it was too dangerous. And, I'm going to actually share how Takata and Nosaka described the training because their words paint a really vivid picture of what they had to go through. And, I want to note that the dog trainers were mostly Caucasian and they did not mix with the Nisei. Ray had mentioned in one interview that it was heavily frowned upon for them to fraternize or get to know each other. So he doesn't really know anything about the dog trainers because they were not friendly and did not spend time with them. So, in Ray and Yasuo's words, to train the attack dogs to hate us, we began by beating one dog at a time, chained to a tree with a knotted burlap bag. Can you imagine the dog growling, snarling, and springing at you every time you hit him with a burlap bag? It didn't take too long before the dogs were growling and pulling on their chains when they saw us coming. Going through this process, we had no protection except for our fatigues. In the next process, the dogs learned to bite the knotted burlap bags. This time we wore a helmet with a neck guard, a face mask, and hockey gloves. We held the knotted burlap in front of our neck. Then at the trainer's command of kill, kill, the dog would rush at us for the knotted burlap at our neck. The dogs would bite it and try to rip it away. There was one dog among the Bouviers who was very bright named Dingo. I would hold the bag above my head and he would jump for it. But we had to watch out for the wild ones. They were sneaky. Instead of going for the burlap bag, they came for your legs. And when they did that, you had to punch them or kick them away. It was like sparring, only you had a dog on the other side. The next process was training the arm dogs, ARM in quotes. This time, we also wore the top half of a heavily padded attack suit. And, when they talk about this heavily padded attack suit, it's not like the full body suits I imagined in the beginning. Ray said it was cobbled together pieces, kind of like what hockey goalies wear, where there's a lot of gaps and it's not like a complete full suit or full protection. So they're wearing this heavily padded attack suit. The burlap bag was looped from our right wrist and the dogs were trained to attack the right arm. When both dogs were ready, they learned to attack together. Since we were being attacked by 2 dogs, we had to wear the full attack suit. Although we did not receive too many bites, we felt the bite through the suit. With Bouvier's, the trainer had a long chain to which he chained the necks of 9 dogs. We had to go down the line before the training with burlap bags, whacking the dogs. So as you came to the first dog, you had the whole pack straining at their chains to get at you. This was the worst part of the training. We were terrified because you only have your fatigues on and 9 dogs are roaring to jump on you and tear you apart. Sometimes we were wondering, what if that long chain breaks? Thank God it never did happen. The dogs were, it always held. And I mentioned that Ray described that the protective gear was like what hockey goalies wear. And he felt it didn't provide adequate protection from the dog attacks. And, he had permanent scars from the dog bites and the attacks that he actually showed me the first time he told me the story. Um, the wolfhounds were trained to slash at the throat. And since they were big dogs, we mentioned that dummies had to be used. It was too dangerous to use live. So the dummies were set up about 70 yards away with a piece of meat tied to their necks. And so at the command kill, the dogs raced for the dummies and slashed the meat away from their necks. So the last part of it was training the bloodhounds. So Nosaka was one of the bloodhound teams. So what he had to do was go all over the island dragging a piece of meat all over. And so the dogs had to follow the meat. And so, Ray and Maeda knew every nook and corner of the island. And the bloodhounds, towards the end of training, were able to trail Ray without even the meat. And, Ray said they used to try and go through the water until they discovered how many alligators were in the water or even snakes around. They're being very careful. I think that, there isn't a lot of information about the training itself because what we're hearing is a perspective of the people who were the bait or who were the targets of it. I could not find any real accounts of the dog trainers, like what was the thought process behind this? What was the reasoning or even the justification? So all we have is, the memories of Ray and Yasuo providing these details of what they observed and what they experienced. But, thankfully we do have this because without it, I doubt that we would be able to find this information through the US Army, given that it was secret training, or even how well it has been documented. But that would be a great project for someone to do one day to see if, from the other end of the perspective, the other perspective. So, based on what Ray said, it almost seemed like getting from Ship Island to Cat Island and back was more perilous in its own way. So a boat with a civilian captain would ferry the men from Ship Island to Cat Island whenever they had to train. But whenever the weather was rough, the civilian captain rightly refused to make the journey because it was like about a 30-minute commute. So the higher ups didn't like that. So they decided they were going to get their own boat so that they could go over whenever they wanted. And they selected a captain from amongst the dog trainers at Cat Island. And according to Ray, the guy they selected wasn't a really good captain. He was a terrible captain who, on the first voyage they went out, he put the boat out on the reef several times. And Ray thought they would have to swim to Cat Island. This guy was so bad. So on the second trip, they actually had a Coast Guard pilot with them. But on the way back, the engine died. And one of the guys climbed up the mast to burn flares for help. And, this Coast Guard picket boat comes by, but they tell them they're on alert and they can't tow them in. And, the weather is really bad and the guys are getting really sick. 3 more picket boats show up and surround them, but none of them are willing to give them a tow back to Ship Island. And I'm guessing you're thinking what I'm thinking is that they come across a boat with all these Japanese looking guys in it. And because it's secret, they probably don't know what they're there for. And they're probably on alert because of them. So Ray says, 1 hour goes by. Most of them are so sick, they're all throwing up. And finally, after an hour, they're able to get a tow back to Ship Island. But that's the end of that special boat and the civilian captain takes over again. Ray tells another story about when the supply boat came. There was a 60 to 70 miles an hour gale blowing, and the captain refused to come in to the shore, and he motions to them to come out to him. And one of the Nisei guys rows out to get the supplies and finds he can't come back because just it's the wind is just too ferocious. And the guys on shore are getting anxious, and they're motioning for the civilian captain to go get the Komatsu, who's stuck out in the boat trying to get in. And the captain ignores them, and they're watching Komatsu get further and further out. And so finally, one of the guys, Nakano, Taneyoshi Nakano, can't stand it. And so he strips down to his bebedes and he swims out to the boat so that he can help Komatsu row back to shore. And Ray said that Nakano was shivering super badly. His skin was blue because it was so cold. And I think Nakano received the Soldier's Medal for heroism for what he did. We do have some descriptions about what life was like, at Cat and Ship Island. So Ray said they had better than banker's hours during this training period, because if they skipped breakfast, they could get up at 9 a.m., go out, train with the dogs for an hour and a half, come back for lunch. In the afternoon, they would train with the dogs at 1 p.m. for about 2 hours and then quit for the day. He said the gang was getting fat, what with all the eating they did and the beer they were drinking. So he said when they reunited with the 100th Infantry Battalion over at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, they were in no condition for infantry training. And, talking about beer, Cat Island was supposedly stocked with enough beer for 3 months, but the supply ran out in 3 weeks. And Ray said it wasn't, there was a reason. He said they had to drink so much beer because the drinking water was brackish. It kind of had a sulfuric taste and smelled like rotten eggs. He said even when they bathed, they couldn't raise a bubble with the soap because there's something about the water. And luckily, their supply officer managed to get them enough beer to last them for the rest of the training period. Another problem they had was they didn't have power. So, they had to have coal for the boiler. And the Army supply ran out really quickly. And the CO just told them, well, if you used up all the coal, so you need to go find your own wood. And so they had a wood detail that would scrounge all over the island looking for dry wood and logs. But, from Hawaii, we don't have snakes. And so they had to learn really quickly to turn over logs before they picked it up because the island had these poisonous coral snakes all over it. And they would also carry buckets when they went to the training grounds to pick up pine cones. And they would use that in the potbelly stoves to heat up the tents at night. Ray said practically every night there was an up game. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. But they said the up game lasted all night because they didn't have to go to work until 9 o'clock, if they skipped breakfast. And the winners would buy cases of beer for the rest of the gang. And, on these long days, Ray Nosaka would be playing his guitar and singing Hawaiian music. And they would pulehu the fish. They would smoke it and eat oysters on the half shell. So they were having fun amidst all of this. But, in all of this, there's that question. So what happened with the dog training? And in an answer, it was a failure. The dogs were not able to determine Japanese blood. They could not train dogs to identify and attack certain races based on their scent. During the assessment of the training, the Army reports say that it was nearly comparable to a vaudeville act. So the Swiss emigre William Prester is immediately fired. Training did continue for another month under Sergeant Pierce of the quartermasters for another with 10 of the Hawaii Nisei. But again, the dog training that they were trying to see if dogs could be trained to smell Japanese blood was a failure. And, according to his daughter Anne, Ray never talked to his family about the experiences that he had at Cat Island. Ray has mentioned in a lot of interviews that he was not allowed to talk about it, that it was secret. I think one record said 10 years. I'm not sure where that comes from, but Ray, it actually wasn't until over 50 years later that Ray gives a talk at my college during one of the 100th 442nd anniversaries that he talked about it, and the family learned about the secret dog training. Not too many people know about this story, but Ray sums it up very well when he says, "Nobody would believe that they selected 25 of us to train the dogs. They said train the dogs, but we call it dog bait. We were the bait." And that's one of the things, the first time I heard this story, I didn't think it was real. I thought it was um, made up. And there's still that disbelief that people would actually think you could train dogs to smell a race of people. And just thinking about the idea behind that of seeing Japanese as so other or so different is so implied in that. There's this random story that I wanted to add on. Ray, 2 years after Ray was on Cat Island training dogs, he found himself in Italy fighting the Germans. And at Hill 100, he's injured by artillery fire. I think it severely wounds his right thigh. And he's unable to walk, so he crawls 20 yards into a cave for shelter. And as he's sheltering there, a stray dog wanders into the cave and actually keeps him warm through the night and stays with him, disappears, the next day. And, Ray talked a lot about that dog that comforted him through the night when he was severely injured. And, again, he brought up how tormented he was about what he had to do on Cat Island to the dogs that he supposedly was helping train. In a broader note, there was a canine service of war dogs where, 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US Army calls on owners of what they called suitable dogs, so dogs that were in good health and were smart. They asked them to volunteer their family pets for selected service and to be trained for national defense. So at that time, there was a lot of fear that there would be sabotage of coastal supply depots, or that coastal areas might get invaded. And they wanted dogs to help guard against that as sentries. And the Quartermaster Corps was tasked with training the dogs. So the Army trained close to 10,500 dogs and created 15 war dog platoons. So I think I read an account that almost 2,000 dogs served overseas as sentries, scouts, messengers, and draft dogs. I didn't find too much documentation on it, but Ray did talk about dogs being used as suicide dogs, where he said boxers were mainly used as suicide dogs, where explosives were tied to the necks of these dogs, and they were trained to enter dugouts or foxholes, and the explosives were then detonated by radio. And I was trying to find where I read it. It was in one of the accounts of the Nisei in the military intelligence. One of them had written that he had been pulled because the military had read Lafcadio Han's translation of Chikomatsu Monzaimon's dramatic works and came to the conclusion that for some reason Japanese people were terrified of badgers, tanuki in the folklore. And they wanted to see what happened if they threw a live badger at this Nisei. And, because they were hoping he would faint or freak out. And could this be used as a tool of war? Freak the Japanese soldiers out by throwing live badgers at them. Other than being freaked out because someone threw a live badger at them, the Nisei said it didn't work. But, whether it's badgers or dogs, this is a chapter in the story of the Japanese Americans during World War II that I don't think should be forgotten. And I really thank um, Jam Pilgrimages for letting me share this story with you. And I think we can turn it to questions, or if there are no questions, I can tell more random stories about life at Cat Island.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was, I mean, equal parts disturbing, but you're such a good storyteller that it also is so engaging and interesting to hear about. And I think just adds a layer to what we think about as, you know, the Nisei military story during World War II. So thank you so much. And thank you to Anne for sharing so much about her dad's story as well. While we're waiting for questions to come in, we missed showing the photos. So would you mind if we showed those photos now and you could maybe tell us a sentence or two about each, just so folks
Sure.
can see? Okay, so I'm going to actually, yeah, perfect. Thanks,
So
Kimmy.
Ray always walked around with a guitar or ukulele, even when he was on the front lines, because he was always singing. And that's McCoy, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, again with the ukulele, because music was such a major part of Ray's life, and he just brought so much joy. This is Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, snow for the first time. So these are the guys, the 25 men who were dog bait during the dog training. Ray on one of his many, many, many fishing ventures, uh, and catching alligators. So these are the dog trainers. Notice they look mostly Caucasian. And again, Ray said they did not intermingle with them at all. They had orders not to be too friendly. I'm suspecting this is in the early days of scouts training before they had to make the dogs hate them. This was R&R time on the island where he got to go horseback riding as well. He's actually cutting wood, for the stove so that they could keep warm at night. And yeah, that's Ray out on the boat. I'm blanking on who he's with. Another of Ray fishing. It's so funny when I showed my friend Johnny Tamora, who's running the tech on this side, he's like squinting in because he wants to see what kind of fish it was. And that's one of the boats they use to go out fishing. Yeah, so Ray fishing.
Wow, those are great. Are those photos from Ray himself, actually, or?
Yeah, that's from Ray's collection.
Okay.
And
Wow.
Ray actually kept all of the letters that he wrote to his wife. So Ray's collection is fascinating.
Wow. And where is his collection housed now? Or
I believe it's with his daughter Anne,
Anne,
but
okay.
most of it has been digitized. So
Okay. That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, Sherry, one question that I have for you, and then I know you have some other great stories that I'd love to hear as well, but you've done a lot of research yourself in this and learning this story and putting together, you know, the pieces of it that you've heard from Ray, et cetera. What was that process like? What were you using to do the research, and what were kind of some of the questions that you were trying to answer as you learned more about this story?
so Ray was featured in the Hawaii Nisei story, and he's actually the feature of the changing, looking like the enemy exhibit over at Pearl Harbor. A lot of it was just interviewing him a lot to just try and take whatever he remembered. But at that time, he was, it'd been so long and memory fades.
Right.
And the funny thing is, it wasn't until much later that he just casually mentioned, "Oh, I wrote about it." And you're like, "What?" And that happened a lot with the guys. It's like it wasn't like you're telling them, "Hey, we're trying to learn more about this story."
Mm-hmm.
And it's like it could be months, it could be years later, they'll just casually drop this bomb on you where you're like, yeah, we wrote this whole essay or manuscript about it. And the thing is, this manuscript that they have is just full of all these incredible details
Mm.
and information. And I'm glad it has not been lost.
Hmm.
That he did mention it, so it wasn't something that got stored away and forgotten, or potentially thrown away.
Hmm.
But that was the thing that allowed us to really tell the story completely. And
Wow.
then history detectives decided that they wanted to look into more of the angle of Prester, the trainer.
Right.
And so, we cooperated with them. And they did a lot of research on the National Archives end, or,
Okay.
with the Freedom of Information. But I regret not asking Ray more, but there is a balance of how much you badger,
Right.
the Nisei, and how much they can actually remember.
Right.
And I thought that I got everything I could. But, as I revisited this story for this talk,
Hmm.
so many questions came up. I mean, even small ones like, why did you call yourselves the Up gang? Why did you do this? What is this? And I kind of wish that I had come back to it when he was still alive and kept trying.
Mm. Right. Though there's so much in that story you told that's just amazing and shows you all of the ins and the complexities, the goods, the bads, the fun things, the really horrifying things that were happening, and just it makes it such a human story in so many ways. Do you know when Ray first started talking about this story or first told it, what the response was? I mean, from his family, but also just from a broader public as people. I mean, as you said, it's a hard story to believe the first time you hear it. But what was his experience of starting to tell the story?
Well, he would talk with his company about the story. And, because when the guys would gather together, at Club 100, they told the real stories when they were together.
Yeah.
And, I mentioned that his daughter had said that at KCC is when she heard it for the first time and she was shocked,
Yeah.
was the word she used. But I think a lot of people, their reaction is disbelief. Like, this can't be serious. This must be a joke. And why on earth would they even think that's possible?
Right. Right.
So I would say disbelief is
Yeah.
the big one.
And was there ever an apology or an acknowledgement? I know, the man in charge was fired and there's, some drama around his departure from the army, but was there ever an acknowledgement to these 25 men of okay, interesting. Yeah.
Ray mentioned that he thought they were all supposed to get medals, um, but he said he never did. When I do see justification for it after the fact, a lot of times what it comes down to is just saying that we were looking for any advantage we could find in the war. And as absurd as this sounds, if this gave us an advantage in the Battle of the Pacific, or the Pacific Theater, then we're going to take it.
Mm.
So there was no apology. It was just, we're going to do whatever we have to do
Right.
to keep our guys alive.
And when you hear the Badger story, which is both so funny and also along the same kind of like, this is absurd, you see that. Not that it excuses the racism, but it yeah, I guess we have to take what's written about the time. So now we have a bunch of questions from the audience. So I will keep my other
So
questions.
just really fast, if
Yes.
anyone, it's an avenue to explore, is that Lafcadio Han, Hearn, he did translate, Monzaimon's writings.
Mm,
And, that was one of the few things we had in English about the Japanese that a lot of people were reading.
yeah.
And so you got to ask yourself, in reading these fantastical stories, what kind of image does that give our military about the Japanese people,
Right.
and their makeup? And it gave a very misleading image.
Right. That's so I hadn't thought about that in that way, that like this is where the stories are coming from that were taken seriously as potentially useful in war. Yeah.
Right.
So one question we have from Doug and Sheila Newlin. Hi, Doug and Sheila. Did Ray and other dog trainers have pet dogs later? And how were their emotions regarding dogs in general after this horrifying experience?
Yeah, Ray loved dogs. I mean, there's a picture of him, small kid time, with a boxer. And he just was always surrounded by dogs.
Hmm.
I don't know if in later years he ended up having dogs as pets. Anne would have to answer that. But um, I think most of them probably had still had good relationship with dogs. I can only speak about Ray.
Hmm.
Ray absolutely loved dogs
Yeah.
before, during, and after.
Mm. Yeah. And that story about after being wounded and having a dog there is powerful.
Yeah, in Hawaii we say chicken skin.
Chicken skin. Yeah, exactly. I know all the three of us backstage were like very listening chicken skin there. Another question from Gordon. Where did this group go after the dog training and when?
So at that point, the 100th had left Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and they went to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. So they rejoined their group with the 100th Infantry Battalion separate, and then they were sent out to Italy. Um, Actually, no. First, they went to Africa to guard, and then when the Red Bull Division took them, Mark Clark took them. Then they went to Italy.
That's great. And as a preview, tomorrow we'll have a session about Camp Shelby, and we'll hear from some veterans as well and their experiences. So tune in, Gordon, tomorrow night again. And then another question from David Fujioka. Did the test soldiers have to sign any sort of confidentiality document before taking part in this program?
I don't know. Ray did not mention that, other than saying that they had orders not to talk about it. So I don't know if they signed anything. I mean, it's the same thing with the MIS guys. They don't talk about signing any confidentiality, but they all mention they're not to talk about what they did. And, most of them did not talk about what they did.
And I mean, even what you were saying before, they talk to each other about it. I think that makes sense, that like it's easier to talk about an experience with someone else who has also experienced it.
Right.
I can imagine trying to explain an experience like this would be very complicated and difficult, and how to even put that into words. Yeah. Oh, hi, Anne. Anne, thanks for tuning in. So this is Ray's daughter. Did grow up with dogs. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Kimiko, for throwing that up. So Sherry, you, before we went live, were sharing some other really wonderful stories about Ray that we'd love to hear if you're willing to share some of those other stories you have.
So I don't know if you can call up the picture of Ray's wedding photo. So when Ray was in training, when he was on furlough, he actually went to, I don't know if it was Chicago or New York, but they met these Nisei women, and he met two sisters and instantly fell in love with one of them and started writing letters. And, the two sisters were Aki and Mary Tamashiro. And, the next time he got a furlough, he went to New York and knocked on their apartment door, and Mary opens up the door, and Mary had been who he had been writing to. And he looked at, Mary's face and said, "Oh, face different." So he had mixed up the two sisters. Ray had instantly fallen in love with Aki, who you see pictured on the screen, but thought her name was Mary and was writing letters to Mary. But when he finally went to visit again, he realized, oh no, it's Aki. And I asked it, this one I asked him all the time, like, well, how did you get out of that one? Because that's pretty awkward.
Oh my gosh.
I was giving a talk in California for Go for Broke, and I told this story because I thought it was funny. And someone in the audience is like, "I know Mary. I'm going to ask her," but I never heard that answer either.
Some things, I guess, have to remain mysteries.
Right.
Oh, that's wonderful. And do you know much about, Ray's life, or any of the guys from this particular group of 25 who were on Cat Island? When they came back, did most of them go back to Hawaii after the war? What were their lives like after they came?
I can only speak to Ray. And Ray's complete life story is at nisei.hawaii.edu. If you want the full URL, /page/Ray. But Ray came back home, and a lot of the guys took advantage of the GI Bill and went to school. They went to college. And in Hawaii, there was this ceiling glass. There was this thing where for Nisei men, they were encouraged to be teachers or business secretaries and not more than that. And all these guys came home from the war, got degrees, people like Ted Tsukiyama. He's like, well, I want to go to like Yale, And so they became doctors, they became lawyers, politicians. In Ray's case, I believe he worked for the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
And it completely transformed Hawaii because you see this group of people ushering in the democratic revolution of Hawaii. You see these people refusing to be placed in the to be discriminated against. There's a famous story about Danny Noe. He became a lawyer and he said, I'm a lawyer, I should have a suit. He was not able to get a loan from the bank because he was not white. And that's the way it was in Hawaii before the war. And it was just accepted. But Danny Noah and a bunch of the other veterans, famously had a bento under a tree at the park and said, let's fix this. And they created their own bank, which is still open today, Central Pacific Bank.
Cool.
But that's like a story to illustrate that these guys change things. Like they came back and said, we're not going to take discrimination. We're not going to accept things as it is. We're going to change it. And they transformed Hawaii.
Mm.
That's a major story in Hawaii, is what
Mm.
they did. But, Ray, what I really admire about Ray is that he devoted a lot of time to the 100th Infantry Battalion Clubhouse. He was president, I think, for quite a number of years. And, their motto is for continued service. And Ray continued to serve his community. And you see that in his daughter as well. And, she is the current president of 100th Infantry Clubhouse. And, this kind of thing was very important to Ray, that the stories be told,
Mm.
that they not be forgotten.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and maybe one day we'll get Anne on here too to be sharing these stories with you. And Sherry, this is going in a little bit of a different direction, but I know you have done so much research and you tell so many stories that I'm also wondering about other stories that you think need to be told more, as we're thinking about, the role of Japanese Americans from Hawaii in World War II, or just, life in Hawaii during World War II, or afterwards. Really, any of these kinds of stories that you would like to see told more. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a preview.
I think, one thing that I really liked about the Hawaii Nisei story that the university did is that the Center for Oral History opted to tell life stories from birth to death. A lot of times when we work in World War II stories, the story starts at the attack on Pearl Harbor and it ends with the atomic bombs dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
And in looking at the history, like the influence of the Issei, the education. So, going to Japanese language school in Hawaii, they were taught Shushin, ethics and morals. So they were taught historical stories of Japanese figures, true stories. And these stories were supposed to serve as guides for how you behave in extraordinary circumstances. And these all taught the values of, honor, loyalty to country, that kind of thing. And those things made them who they were. It defines it. I think it explains why they were so extraordinary when they did go to war. The other part of the story I think that's really important is, as I said, what happened when they came home. In Hawaii, they had a significant impact on how the state became such a democratic stronghold. But the other thing that I really want people to do is look at the stories of women. In Hawaii, women's lives were drastically changed as well. And, because the men were gone,
Right.
women who typically would have stayed on a plantation doing menial work suddenly were able to get office jobs. Their lives completely transformed as well. But you have Nisei Wax, like Chito Isonaga, because of her language skills, she was able to help with translations or interpretations. And, I think she eventually joined the CIA. But you don't hear too much about them and what they did. In Hawaii, we have what we call the Forgotten Battalion, the 1399 engineers, because they didn't serve, they were a segregated unit, but because they did not serve on the front lines, people don't tend to pay attention to them. And so I think there's lots of stories. I think for me personally, the window has closed on, really trying to get oral histories or interview the veterans because of age and memory. But you know how I mentioned that Ray casually dropped that, hey, I've got a manuscript.
Hmm.
We need to find those.
Hmm.
We need to find those manuscripts. We need to find whatever the guys put together. Like, was there informal oral history recorded by their grandchild for their History Day project?
Right.
Those things are invaluable.
Right.
And I don't know how many we lose. I mean, Stanley Akita he was a 100th replacement.
Hmm.
I'd known him for months before he casually tells me, oh, I wrote a memoir. I don't think it's any good. You want to see it? I'm like, yeah, I want to see it. And his memoir was amazing because it was written in the 1950s and it,
Hmm.
in incredible detail, documented his time as a prisoner of war in Stalag 7A.
Mm.
And, I worry that we are not, like, worst case scenario is a family doesn't realize what it is and throws it away.
Right.
Just as bad as it gets in the hands of collectors who put it on eBay,
Right. Right.
or just sits in someone's closet, deteriorating.
Right.
I'm hoping that there is a push that we can find these things and then find a home for them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's sort of been a bit of a theme today and this weekend. And for with all of these pilgrimages and educational sessions and talks, it's just the more that you understand and know about history, about your own community, about your family, the more you're able to recognize those kinds of things as they come and ask, your grandparents and your parents and neighbors and elders as while they're still with you, these kinds of questions. Yeah. And I think what you were saying about paying attention to what changed at home also for women and for, a lot of communities across the United States, not just Japanese Americans, obviously, is really important in stitching together this, more honest, true narrative of how the United States evolved during the 20th century.
And I'm a huge fan of looking for the quiet heroes.
Mm-hmm.
So like Sue Isonaga, she's a schoolgirl, live-in schoolgirl for Robert Shivers, the FBI agent in charge of Honolulu or Hawaii. She's the first Asian they've ever encountered, and they fall in love with her, and they want to adopt her. And Sue has Shivers said, "I cannot let Sue and people like Sue be taken away." And he's one of the strongest voices against Japanese American or Japanese ancestry people being forcibly removed from Hawaii.
Yeah.
And you have Sue Isonaga just having such a huge impact on the history of Hawaii in her quiet way. And the other thing too is that there's treasures like Barbara Kawakami, who quietly collected, I think, over 200 audio tape interviews of first generation, Japanese women in Hawaii Ise,
Right.
the ones who were picture brides on the plantation.
Mm-hmm.
There's people who are doing these things, and I think they need to have a spotlight shone on them because they are just creating these priceless treasures for us, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
we need to be one of them. We need to be a Barbara Kawakami.
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah.
Quietly in our way, we do that. But one thing I always tell people is that I found it interesting in all the years of research that the soldiers would say, my kids are not interested in my stories. They're not interested in my war stuff. But then you talk to the kids, and the kids would always say, Dad wouldn't talk about it. And I think what I discovered was that the kids didn't know what questions to ask. Because if you ask a question like, Dad, tell me about the war, it's difficult to answer that question. You end up with the generic public story they would tell, the stories that were humorous,
Right.
or sanitized or clean.
Right.
And it wasn't the stories they would tell with their buddies or with people and I think it's because they didn't know the question. Like, the questions had to be more specific.
Right.
The questions had to be, it's almost like the kids should have done enough research so that, like in the case of Ray, it would be like, hey, Dad, so what was, so you would know what to ask and when to push.
Right.
and how to clarify and things like that. And it's hard. So I
Yeah.
think it does take someone that knows the history to be able to pull it out.
Yeah. And it's hard. I think it's hard to ask your own parents these questions. Like I think about this, even I bug my dad with questions all the time now, but it's hard. You're close. And so I think a lot about the sort of generational privilege of being a granddaughter and asking these questions about my grandparents, because there is a little bit of a more separation there. But yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that, Sherry. And we have a question that I would also like to ask. So I'm going to ask it as we wrap up here, which is from Gordon, who says, Sherry, are you planning any story sharing episodes coming up? Because obviously we're ready for more stories from Sherry.
That is a good question. If I do that, I will let Gem Pilgrimages know. I just, right now I'm involved in just the whole thing of collecting stories.
Mm-hmm.
And, in Hawaii, we have so much incredible stories, like so many restaurants were owned by
Right.
Hawaii Okinawans, just documenting. But I'm also looking at this idea of how else we can share these stories.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's in a format like this, but, like in Hawaii, we have a really famous Okinawan festival that used to draw when it was in person, what's like 50 to 60,000 people over 2 days. And, they're very focused on this topic. And so taking an exhibit that tells the story of the MIS in the Battle of Okinawa was powerful because we were able to reach so many people that wouldn't have gone to a museum, maybe wouldn't have tuned into a YouTube series. And I really like the idea of us finding creative ways to tell stories
Yeah.
in so many different formats and
Yeah.
ways.
Mm.
But thank you very much for that question. I it's inspiring. I will try to carve out time for that.
But I think you're right. It's thinking about, how you reach people in as many ways as you can with these stories, because history is around us all of the time. And it's helpful to sometimes be sort of help to see what it is and how it's shaping, where we are. And I think about, I was lucky enough to spend some time with Sherry in Hawaii a few years ago, and I learned so much just from like hanging out with you and your family. So I will sign up for any Sherry Tamashiro storytelling sessions that happen.
I do have a request.
Yes.
Um, I think that the Japanese American community has done a wonderful job preserving and sharing the story. I would like to see us help the Filipino American story come to light.
Mm.
So the story of the Filipino Americans during World War II. I don't hear it as much as I do the Japanese
Mm-hmm.
stories, and you can't find a lot of scholarship about it. So, storyteller Alton Chung has actually been working for the past year on telling the story about the first and second Filipino infantry
Mm-hmm.
scouts, and and what happened when the U.S. broke their promises to the Philippine scouts. They
Mm-hmm.
promised that they could become U.S. citizens, that they would get benefits, and that promise was broken.
Right.
um, I think that we're in a good place, where I think we've done such a wonderful job. There's so much engaged and dedicated, passionate people. And
Mm-hmm.
I would love it if we could reach out a hand and bring the Filipino World War II story to light, because it's such a tragic story. And I see so many parallels with our
Absolutely.
story.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really kind of beautiful message and charge to leave us with. And I think also the Salinas Rodeo Center, which was one of the assembly centers on the West Coast where Japanese Americans were sent after Japanese Americans were sent to camps. It was used to house some of the Filipino soldiers. And so thinking about also the ways that our histories are taking place on the same places, we're also often up against similar forces in a lot of ways. Yeah, I absolutely think that's a wonderful charge. And I can't wait to hear Alton's story. Maybe during the next iteration of Tadaima, we can have more Alton storytelling.
Yeah, because he actually found there were Filipino women who were serving, and they were fierce.
Whoa.
And I
Yeah.
want to learn about them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is something to look forward to.
But actually, I did want to thank John Itomura, who's the executive director of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association, because he hosted me here. And I don't know, John, can you bring Moose? So while I was giving this talk, he brought his dog Moose over. So Moose was under the table while I was talking. So this is John Itomura
Hi,
and
John.
Moose.
Hi, Moose. Wow,
Moose.
this is amazing. Hi, Moose. Hi, Moose. Wow. Yeah, we were joking before about having a dog named Moose at a session about Cat Island. Lots of things happening, but that's awesome. Thank you so much, John. This was fantastic and flawless. And thank you, Sherry. Thank you, folks, for tuning in and asking your questions. Please come back tomorrow for more live programming. And Sherry, just thank you so much for your time, for sharing these stories, and for leaving us with things to think about too.
Aloha. The shaka.